Welcome everybody to this Edge of Mind podcast where I say this a lot, but there are times when I really mean it. This is one of those times. I'm so excited to introduce you to Delson Armstrong, who, as you'll see, is really a remarkable individual. And as usual, what I will do, I will read a slightly abridged version of his bio. We'll have the whole thing posted on the link to this particular podcast, but I'll start with that and then send a salvo of questions Delson's way, covering just a vast array of different topics here. So let me just clue this back in. There we go. So Delson Armstrong began his spiritual journey with yogic meditation at the age of 13. He traveled to India, where he studied at international school for 3 years and completed his A-levels through the University of Cambridge International Examination Center for the British Council. When he returned to the United States, he graduated from the New York Film Academy. I mean, how cool is that? With a concentration in screenwriting, and began his writing career by publishing 3 books and now ghostwrites for publishers, studios, and private clients. He has attained all 6 degrees of Kriya Yoga under the lineages, and there's a host of these lineages, and with your permission, Delson, I'll just skip over those because they can read them. Sure. Plus, my facility with Sanskrit and Pali is I'll probably trip over all these amazing names. He studied the Upanishadic contemplative traditions also under successive lineages, and Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, where he's attained all 10 levels of samadhi, or the meditative states of absorption, that we are definitely going to be talking about. He's also practiced Jnana Yoga and self-inquiry through the lineages of Ramana Maharshi and Nisargadatta Maharaj, 2 of my major heroes, and attained the level of Sahaja Samadhi, effortless absorption, and studied the teachings of J. Krishnamurti and U.G. Krishnamurti. He then shifted to TWIM. Maybe we can talk a little bit about what that acronym means. By completing an online retreat by David Johnson in 2016, he is now leading both off-site physical retreats and online retreats as time permits. Delson took to the TWIM method easily. And let me just toss this in. The reason I'm reading the extended biography for you all is Delson's history is, as we'll see, is quite extraordinary. And I think the more we can contextualize the framework, where he's coming from, what got him to this particular space, I think the more traction we'll have with our conversation. So that's why the somewhat more lengthy introduction. So he took to the TWIM practices easily, understood the concepts of the 6 R's, perhaps another rich topic that we can talk about, Delson, without much guidance. He has taken the deep dive into the practice and is able to easily guide students to the most sublime states of progress. He was asked by the Venerable Bhante Vimalaramsi specifically to start teaching. And what a beautiful human being he is. While guiding online retreats, he supports individuals on their journey, interacts with research institutions on neuroscience, cognitive behavioral therapy, and the phenomenology of meditation. When situations allows for it, he is open to guiding physical retreats around the world upon invitation. His teachings are freely available to all. And I really want to say a couple personal things about that last note, Delson, and also plug your beautiful book, which I hope we get a chance to talk about. I'm really grooving on this thing. It's really a rich ride. But what's one of the things, Delson, that's really touching to me is your honest, true, selfless service to the truth, to the Dharma, that you offer so much freely. You spend your life in the retreat, you spend your life really in the service of reality, in the service of truth, as a representative of reality. And to me, that's really inspiring. And that's why I'm so excited to introduce you to my community so they can reap the benefits of your extraordinary mind and your capacities and your path. But I do want to say the vast majority of our conversation for sure will be in your court and allowing you to really run with your stories. And I mean this in the highest complimentary sense. You are a fantastic storyteller. Some of our mutual friends have sent me links, and I'm going, I would love to do a campfire event with this guy and just sit around having marshmallows and hot dogs all night long. You are an amazing storyteller. And so it is with that kind of preparatory set of comments on my long-winded part that I open and embrace what you have to offer and what you will share with us today. And so with that, before we get into some of the really, really meaty stuff, dependent origination, the stuff that I really love to talk about, the granularity, the particulars of the nature of the mind as it's revealed in contemplative meditative practice, you absolutely positively have to tell us a little bit about yourself and your stories, some of your capacities and capabilities. And so let's start with that, and then maybe I will direct you a little bit to share with our audience how you got to this particular station in your life, what brought you here, and where you aspire to go. So thank you for giving me permission to give an unusually long introduction on my part, but because I think the dialogue, the nature of our conversation, I think understanding respective frameworks and contexts will be important, because you'll be using Pali language, perhaps I'll be using Sanskrit. And so there will be some commonalities, and there'll also be some areas of difference. So tell us about yourself a little bit.
Yeah, I think the bio does a pretty good job, but for me, I've always been somebody who's been a contemplative, somebody who's always exploring the nature of reality ever since I could remember, and that's for quite some time. I was always fascinated by an idea of, there's something more to this world than just what we see in terms of the physical reality that we understand through the six sense spaces, for example. And, one thing I think people don't really know too much about it, the one thing that really got me into the contemplative tradition is, as a child, I was such a big fan of Star Wars, right? And so Star Wars is really what got me into
It's too great. It's
wow,
awesome.
okay, so is there such a thing as the Force? Can I become a Jedi? Can I wield a lightsaber? Those kinds of things when I was a little kid. And so that really kind of made me jump into, what is mysticism and what are the different kind of traditions. Now, I grew up in a family that was very open-minded, very much, my father, he would always tell me, when you're ready, you can just decide what you want to do in terms of how you want to lead your life and everything else. And he always said, do what makes you happy as long as it doesn't inhibit others' ability to be happy, right? So that I really took to heart. And so my parents were always very open about a lot of things. And I grew up in a Catholic household, although we
Me too.
weren't really practicing Catholics. And I did that whole thing. I did my first Holy Communion, my confirmation, I was an altar boy, all of that stuff. But towards the age of 12 or 13, I was introduced to yoga, to hatha yoga, by a family friend. And I went with him, and he said, "Do you want to try out a yoga session?" So I did that with him, and I was just so kind of stoned by it. I was like, "Wow, this is amazing! I feel so relaxed. I feel like as if I'm in a different dimension. Is it possible to replicate this again with yoga, doing what we just did?" And he gave me a compendium of yoga literature, like, hey, try this out, check this out. So he introduced me to BKS Iyengar, and then other yogis. And, so I started looking on my own as a 13-year-old, and I was just so fascinated by it. And I remember sharing it with my mother, and my mother, even though she still continues to be somewhat of a practicing Catholic, had a lot of deep knowledge about different kinds of traditions within the Indian culture. So I was kind of void of that kind of culture because I grew up in the U.S. Although I was born in Bombay, we moved to the U.S. when I was 5. So I wasn't really introduced too much to that kind of culture. But I remember she told me, she went to Nepal, she went to different temples, she did a lot of different things. And so when she saw me having this interest in yoga, she really pushed me along towards it with, a lot of interesting conversations. And she herself does yoga. She herself is a yogi in some ways. And then when we went back to India when I was 13, that's really when I had the culture shock.
Mm.
And I was not really prepared to understand anything that was going on. I mean, the first time you ever go to India, it's an assault on the senses, right? I mean, there's just
Yeah, big
so many
time.
things to see, so many things to smell, so many things to hear. You just stand in the middle of the road and there's just amazing influx of sensory experience that's going on. So that was one thing. And then really starting to see, oh, this is a different kind of culture than what I grew up in, which was the American culture, let's say. But that just pulled me deeper into it. And then, like you've said, I went to an international school. It was called Pathways. It's still there. It's in a place called Gurgaon, which is close to Delhi. And I wasn't really interested in school a lot, but I had a teacher there who was he was teaching drama, but he was also a yogi. And so I decided to leave school, and he invited me to come and spend some time with him in the Himalayas. So we went to Haridwar, we went to Rishikesh, we went to Uttarkashi, we went to some caves, we went, rafting in the Ganges, met some interesting people, went to different kinds of yoga institutes, and that was really my, let's say, formal education, or the beginning of my formal education into yoga, and into some sorts of, let's say, Shaivite Tantra, and Buddhism came about much later. I did get into Tibetan Buddhism much later, very little bit. I was introduced to it by Lama Lina,
Mhm,
Dzogchen, Mahamudra, those kinds of
mhm,
things. And I will say, I mean, to your point, I think there's also some interesting overlap between,
mhm.
let's say, the Dzogchen traditions and what we do in TWIM, which is especially about that spacious quality of mind and so on. But we'll get to it as we get deeper into the
Yeah.
discussion. Anyway, so, and then my other part of my life was, like you just said, like my film career, and that was really a lot of ghostwriting stuff that I did. Um, and now that's translated into me doing these books for Buddhism. So I'm right now working on a book on dependent
Yeah,
origination,
beautiful.
and I always joke, and I'm almost done with it, but I'm still stuck in craving. The chapter on craving.
Well,
So
there's a few things to say about that, right?
yeah, yeah. So I'm taking it a little bit at time, and I'm also doing a lot of retreats now. I'm here
Mhm,
at Damasuka, which
mhm,
is in Missouri, and I'm doing some retreats until the end of August, and then I'll be going to India, where I'll be doing some retreats there. So the way I kind of got into the teaching mode, if you will, is I was always continuing to be fascinated by the meditative arts, right? So I got introduced to Bhante Vimaramsi through YouTube. I saw some of his videos, and he was talking about dependent origination. He was talking about metta practice, and I was actually interested in understanding what the metta practice was about. So you could say I was sort of an experimenter, right? I wanted to try yogic meditation. I wanted to try self-inquiry, bhakti yoga, Advaita Vedanta, and now I wanted to get into metta practice. So I really did an online retreat with David Johnson, one of the senior students here and teachers here, and I had some great experiences from it. I mean, I was like, wow, I've not experienced anything like this before. I've had similar experiences, but not in this context. And so we exchanged emails back and forth about the practice, and they had me do things like determinations, going to this jhana and that
mhm,
jhana, doing this,
mhm,
doing that.
mhm,
That was a lot of fun. And then I had a chance to meet him. I want to say 2017, I believe. That was he was in California. I was in San Diego at the time, and he was doing a retreat in San Juan Bautista. So David Johnson said, "Why don't you come and meet us?" And so I went and saw him for the day, and we had a great conversation, about an hour-long conversation about the Dhamma. And towards the end of it, he said, "What are your plans for the future? Do you have an interest in teaching?" And I hadn't really considered it before, but since he was asking me this, I said, I would consider it with your permission. And he said, yeah, you have it. You should start teaching.
cool.
So, I started doing online teaching. I did a lot of online guided retreats and things like that. But it wasn't until actually 2020 that I got into like teaching, let's say over Zoom. It started off where I went to India during the pandemic or just before the pandemic, and I wanted to go on retreat. And I was on retreat, and there was a whole story about that because, you know, I can go into cessation for a determined amount of time. So there was a situation where there's a cave up in Uttarkashi, which I usually go to. And there's a friend of mine who stays nearby and he has a place. So the idea was I would go into the cave for 6 days and come back and then, you know, replenish myself and then go back again for another 6 days. So I went into cessation, but about halfway through it, about 3 days later, the pandemic hit and then there was a lockdown. So my friend and a few of his buddies came to get me because the lockdown was going on and nobody could be out. And they found they couldn't shake me. They were just like, they thought something had happened. Maybe I went into a coma or something had happened. So they took me back to their place and they sent a message to David and said, you know, this is what's going on with Delson. You know, is he dead? Is he in a coma? What's going on? And David said, oh, don't worry, he'll be fine. Just wait for another 3 days, you know, and see what happens. And I remember waking up or opening up my eyes, and I was on the bed, and there was just these lights around, and I thought to myself, okay, I've done it now. I've gone beyond 7 days, and somehow I've ended up in a Brahmaloka. There's all these lights over here, you know.
Oh my God, it's too
And
funny.
so,
That's awesome.
but then they told me, my friend told me, he said, no, this is what happened and you can't go back into the cave. So I had to finish the rest of my retreat for about the next 4 or 5 months at his place. I had my own room there. But as that was happening, you know, there was an individual, Kuhn Bigelar, who's one of the founders of the Suttavada Foundation. He got a hold of me via email because he saw some of the preliminary studies that were happening, very unscientific because it was just through the Muse headband that talked about, I mean, that showed how the mind is when it's in jhana and cessation and things like that. So he sent me an email and he said, is it okay if I, you know, send some emails, get some clarification on certain things? And I said, yeah, that's fine. And then, you know, he said, is it okay if you talk over WhatsApp? And I said, that's fine. And so it started to become where on a weekly basis, I would speak with him and then a few of his other friends who were in the meditation community. And really, that's where my teaching started, let's say teaching quote unquote career took off. And then that became into where I did weekly Zoom talks about the Dhamma, and then eventually started doing online retreats. And now here I am, you know, just teaching full time.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Boy, you've pinged on a number of things that we've ventured into the deep end of the pool rather quickly, but I have to chuckle. Isn't it interesting, Delson, what it takes sometimes, different folks for different strokes, what gets you into the Dharma? For you, it was Star Wars. For me, it was Kung Fu. Do you remember that? Probably you're too young, but the TV series with David Carradine, where, you know, he was the Kung Fu master, and he was evicted and he come to the United States and you know, he basically be spiritual. And at the end of each session, he'd have to kick some ass, right? It was like, I want to be like David Carradine. And so for you wanted to be a Jedi. I wanted to be David Carradine. And I think, you know, somewhat tongue in cheek, but also somewhat importantly, because to me, this is the definition of upaya, skillful means, is not meeting people where you're at, but meeting people where they're at. Yeah. And that requires tremendous sensitivity, openness, the ability to listen, and really to understand what's going to speak to this particular person. I think that's very important because it's not a one size fits all thing. On one level, the Dharma, reducibly, all Dharmas agree on one point, but the way in is different for all of us. And so I love these kinds of stories because, hey, again, it's like, I don't care where it comes from. If I can get to the center of this mandala using Kung Fu or the Jedi thing, I'm there, I'm with it. Yeah. But a couple of things here, you pinged out a couple of terms for our listeners that I think we need to explore because these are so compelling. One is, well, three things. One, talk to us briefly about the jhanas, what those are. The role of determination, because this is, in the Buddhist world that I roll in, these are terms that are not frequently tossed about. And so this is one of the wonderful things I learned from you already. It was like, whoa, this is really interesting stuff. So talk to us a little bit about, this is a colossal topic, so I understand it, but you bring not only a sophisticated doctrinal understanding, but most importantly, experiential traction footing here. You sit the walk, right? You walk the talk, so to speak. So the relationship of the jhanas to the determinations. And then, of course, we have to spend a little bit more time talking about Nirodha Samapati. And I've heard this pronounced different ways. It's Samapati, some people say Samapati, some people say, I don't know which one is correct. You can help me there. But these are wonderfully fruitional states in the Theravadan tradition that you have tremendous facility with, that maybe you can talk to us a little bit about this. Like, why is this important? And then I'm going to come back. I want to throw this up so I don't forget it. I love the way you also have this interest with science, and we'll talk more about that. The lab studies that you're doing with scientists, I know some of these people as you do. And so I want to toss this out in this capacity, because not only from a dharmic role, Delson, but from a purely evolutionary role, it's not particularly advantageous from an evolutionary point of view to enter Nirodha Samapati, right? I mean, that from a Darwinian point of view, that makes like no sense. Like, why would you do that? You're setting yourself up to be eaten by a tiger, right? So before we jump to that, I just want to say before I forget, give us a little preview of this wonderfully sophisticated topic of the 8 states, the jhanas, and then the postdoc school, Nirodha Samapati, and then the role of determination and all that, because this is so fascinating to me. And the reason I think it's so important for our listeners is because it points out the wonders of the mind, that we have these extraordinary capacities that if we have exemplars like yourself and others, these can be real sources of inspiration for us. It's like, oh my gosh, I had no idea this potentiality was even available for a mind. Wow, there's a role model. Maybe I can work to cultivate something like that. So speak to us about these somewhat beautiful topics.
Sure. So, I mean, you did touch a little bit about dependent origination. I mean, you mentioned it. So I will say from the context of, the 4 noble truths, right? So we talk about suffering, the cause of suffering or the conditions to suffering, and then the cessation of that and the path leading to it. So we can look at dependent origination as the second noble truth, as an elaboration of that. When we talk about the jhanas, it's an elaboration of the third noble truth, which is the cessation of suffering. So the way I explain what jhanas are, yes, they're different states of mind and states of experience, but they're also different levels of cessation of suffering. And so what that means is, we also have to understand that there's so many different opinions about what jhana is and what jhana isn't, because there's some schools that say that jhana is a very highly concentrated, super focused state. And, the tradition and the community that I'm with, we say that the jhanas are much looser than that. I mean, there is still collectedness of mind, which is to say that you have an object of meditation and your attention or like a satellite around that particular object as a way of keeping the mind collected. But there's an open awareness there. There's an open presence of mind there that allows you to be able to notice and acknowledge when hindrances arise. Because what we look at and the way we see it is hindrances, whether it's sensual craving, aversion, restlessness, sloth and torpor, doubt, whatever it might be, they are actually teachers. They allow you to see where the mind's attachments and aversions lie. So dealing with them head on by understanding and acknowledging them, and then letting them go in the right way, which is what we talk about in the 6 R's, allows the mind to become more collected. So my very basic definition of jhana is basically that it's the non-presence of any kind of afflictive states of mind, that is to say the hindrances, and the presence of certain uh, positive states or wholesome states of mind, which include the 7 enlightenment factors. And then based on that being collected, what happens is there's joy that arises, there's some comfort in the body that arises, and so on. So, with the first jhana, there's 4 main factors to it. There's the vitakka and the vichara, which is really the thinking and examining thought. And what that really is, the setting the intention to start to get into a meditative state of mind, and then placing your attention on an object. Simply put, that's really the way to look at it in this tradition. And then as a result of that, because there's relief in the mind from any afflictive states, there's a natural joy that arises. So the idea isn't to cultivate and create and construct a state of joy.
Yeah.
It's rather to relax and rest into the natural presence of joy in that particular jhana. And then there's the sukha, which is the comfort and pleasure in the body. Now, once you start to really get collected, you don't need to continue to be with your object. The mind is naturally with the object. So now you get into the second jhana, where there is the cessation of the vitaka and vichara. And so the mind is now just really collected, very happy, very unified, but not one pointed, not focused, not to a point where it becomes like this laser. Rather, it's still very open and it's very much present with what's going on. And then the third jhana, it's a reduction of the joy, and that happens quite naturally. And so now the joy changes into a more balanced equanimity, more peaceful, tranquil balance of mind. And then the fourth is where the mind becomes like a very highly polished marble stone. There's nothing going on, and it's just the presence of mind that's there. This what it's called is the mindfulness due to equanimity, or mindfulness purified by equanimity, if you will. And why that is because as you're going through these jhanas, you're cycling through the enlightenment factors. So every time you cycle through, so the enlightenment factors can be seen as a linear process, but they can also be seen as a cyclical process. So just for listeners out there, it's basically mindfulness, which leads to investigation of states, which leads to energy, which leads to joy, which leads to tranquility, which leads to collectedness, which leads to equanimity. But what I say here is the equanimity then conditions the next arising of mindfulness. Your mindfulness only gets that much clearer as you progress through the jhanas. Now, technically, there's only 4 jhanas. But what happens is at the fourth jhana, there are 4 states of mind or experience that arise. And these are known as ayatanas, spheres or dimensions. So we have the experience of infinite space, the infinite consciousness, nothingness, and neither perception nor non-perception. So what happens is, in our tradition, mainly what we do is we take metta, we take loving kindness as the beginning part of the meditation, because it just naturally makes you feel happy, and you're naturally more open to the joy that arises. And eventually, as you progress through the 4 jhanas and you get to the 5th state of infinite space, your mind becomes very expansive. It's boundless space, and there's this spaciousness that's all around. And that metta, that loving kindness, changes into what's known as karuna, or compassion. And now you have compassion for all beings in all places, in all dimensions, time and space. And so this experience becomes so expansive that the consciousness that arises dependent upon this experience starts to actually break down. So, infinite consciousness usually is talked about as being an understanding of now that consciousness fills that expansive space. But we go a step further, and what we say is that expansive consciousness is actually made up of, uh, let's say, iotas or data packets of consciousnesses. And what that means is, one of the analogies I use is like, you think about, a ray of light, a ray of sunshine, that sunlight that comes through, and it looks like one ray of light, but actually that's made up of quintillions and quintillions of individual photons. So same in here, what we see is the arising and passing away of individual, let's say, consciousnesses. Once we start to see that, we might see it like, eye contact, ear contact, nose contact, tongue contact, body contact, or even mind contact. And each time there's contact, we see the arising and passing away of consciousness depending upon that particular sense space. Now, when that happens, we're seeing in that process that everything is dependently arisen, and because it's conditioned, it's impermanent. So we're not reflecting on it. We're seeing for ourselves as things arise and pass away, that there is impermanence here. And as things start to get tiresome, we see the inherent dukkha in there. We see the inherent suffering of these conditioned experiences. And because of that, we see the impersonal nature of conditioned experience. And once we see the impersonal nature, we develop a level of equanimity. So with infinite space, the karuna then goes into mudita, or empathetic joy at infinite consciousness. That mudita then transforms into equanimity, or upeka, at the level of nothingness. And this nothingness arises naturally as well. What happens is, in each arising and passing away of consciousness, the gap widens. And as the gap widens, the mind starts to become more aware of those gaps. And now you're just into this plane of nothingness, this dimension of nothingness tied to equanimity. Now, even that becomes quite coarse. And what happens is the mind gets, so all this time we're radiating karuna if we're in infinite space, we're radiating mudita if we're in infinite consciousness, and we're radiating upeka if we're in nothingness. But eventually that too becomes quite coarse. And mind sort of just goes in on itself. It wants to rest in itself. And this is really the experience of papasara chitta, the luminous, radiant mind, as it's understood in Pali. Excuse me. So we stay here for a bit, and eventually we get into what's known as neither perception nor non-perception. And this is a very interesting state to be in, because it's like, when we talk about perception, what perception is, the mind's ability to recognize and label things as they arise. But in either perception or non-perception, it's like the sankharas, the formations that arise, are kind of looked at or cognized, but they're not fully recognized as something. So it's like you're starting to see the percolations of thoughts arising before they actually arise in neither perception and non-perception. And eventually you come to a point what's known as the signless state of mind. It's the animitta samadhi. And here it's an objectless awareness. Before, you were taking mind itself as an object. And then you let go of even that, and it's just this pure awareness that's looking out into space, like a flashlight that looks out into space and doesn't land anywhere. And eventually the batteries run out, and that's the fuel for attention. And then you basically drop into the cessation of perception, feeling, and consciousness, which is nirodha.
There's so much to unpack here, and I'm glad you took a little pause. A couple of things here, Delson. Really, this is so rich. Is really just to put it again in the context you're talking about the four Brahma Viharas. Right. You didn't mention that overtly, but that's really another framework for what you're discovering, the four divine abodes. And it's really fantastically beautiful because it starts from the outside, especially with in your approach with metta, with this loving kindness, Sanskrit Maitri, that becomes your object. And I love that, because to me, I think Sanskrit Pali, right? Chitta, same word, mind, heart. We tend to think, oh, meditation is all just cerebral, cognitive, mental thing. No. It's just, mindfulness is just as much heartfulness. Yes. And so I love the fact that this particular approach starts with more of the heart, because maybe the Tibetans, again, there's near enemies and near friends to every one of these trajectories. And perhaps some of the excessive, so to speak, emphasis on the cerebral mental aspect sometimes can be a little bit dissociative towards this more affective, emotional, loving component. I think that's incredibly important. A couple other things here. There's so much you said here that's just so interesting to me. One is, you intimated at the outset, I want to come back to this because this is important. On one level, you mentioned the word attainments, and there does seem to be this, the way I look at it, Delson, let me test my understanding with you. Two authentic vectors of understanding the meditative journey. One is, in fact, the path quality of attainment acquisition. I want to attain these particular states, these samadhis, these whatever. I think is utterly valid, the path of effort. But however, and you mentioned this, and that's why I want to circle back to it, I think it's perhaps more valid, just as valid, but perhaps more so, the path of effortlessness. That fundamentally, it's as much, if not more, a process of discovery. On one level, these states can seem remarkable and extraordinary, But on another level, they're absolutely utterly ordinary. Samsara is what's extraordinary. These are ordinary states. And the reason I think this is important, because we in the West, we tend to be somewhat acquisition goal oriented. Oh, I need to attain this. I need to attain that. I'd love to hear what you think about this, because I think at the highest levels, once one exhausts that, then you realize what the Hindus talk about is anupaya, the path of no path, that even the notion of path itself can become counterproductive. So please talk to us a little bit more about that. And then I want to say more about the atomistic nature, the discovery of the dharma, small d, because I think that's incredibly important. There's other things I want to say here, but let's talk about this a little bit, because on one level, to me, I get two vibes when I hear this. One is, wow, this is tremendously inspiring. On another level, whoa, this is really intimidating, right? I can never attain that. I can never get there. And so therefore, I think the second aspect of the path of discovery can allow us, you said, open, relax. And in the Mahamudra Dzogchen teachings, really, one word summarizes the whole shebang: relax.
Yeah.
Open, relax. That's it. Interview's over, podcast done, path is done. We're both out of work, right? But on another level, it's too simple, it's too obvious. What do they say? It's hiding in plain sight, it's too obvious. We don't see it, but you get the point. So talk to us a little bit about the reconciliation between the path of attainment and effort, which is completely legitimate, versus the more, perhaps, if we could dare say, absolute path of effortless relaxation and openness.
Yeah. So, the way to unpack that, in my understanding, is, I think it's sort of like having a compass, or setting a rudder to where you want to head towards. And insofar as that's concerned, that is known as, in Pali, which is a wholesome desire, if you will, a wholesome placing of mind towards a goal. But that's where it stops. It's just you're guiding your mind towards some kind of direction. Anything beyond that, I would see as starting to create in the mind a lot of agitation and restlessness. And as you said, talking about these attainments can be a little intimidating for people in the beginning. So the key central point for the practice, when we're doing it into twin practice, is actually, as you just mentioned, relax.
Yeah.
So that's why I say, and I emphasize, that jhanas, or these experiences, are levels of cessation, and they're levels of relaxation.
Yeah. So let me interrupt. So in a certain way, there is, like Meister Eckhart said, on the path, we don't proceed by addition, we proceed by subtraction.
Right.
The via negativa, hence all the nirs, nirodha, nirvana, nisprapancha, all the negations. So that's another way classically, and sorry for the interruption, to work with the cessation, really understanding that it really is a process of negation, not addition. How can you attain something you already have and already are? So
right. So nibbana. Yeah, go ahead.
No. I just want to put an exclamation point on this, because I think this is critically important for one's understanding of the notion of path itself. Because on one level, absolutely, completely viable thing, this thing called path. But on another level, perhaps more fruitional level, the path itself becomes an obstacle. So anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just want to put an exclamation point on that.
No, and I'm glad you did, because that's a good point to bring up, which is nirvana, or nibbana in Pali. It's really it's understood as that which is unconstructed, or unformed, or uncreated. So, the misconception with people when they start out on the path, or let's say people, and it's no issue. I mean, it's just because of the way people have been brought up and the way they think you need to accomplish things, is by adding to it, by creating something, by constructing something, by formulating something. But then as they start to get deeper into this practice, they realize, oh, all of that is rooted in an understanding or misunderstanding of an idea of identification, or misidentification of what needs to be done. And really, what needs to be done is what we call right effort in the Eightfold Path. Right effort is really not about constructing an experience. It's actually about deconstructing reality. So nibbana is actually the deconstruction process
Beautiful.
that allows you to get to the Dhamma, that allows you to get to reality as it actually is. So, when we talk about right effort, we talk about it from a mnemonic device, which is known as the 6 R's.
Mhm.
And that's really the core, the heart of that is the relaxed step. So, very simply put, what it is, you recognize that you are distracted, you release your attention from it, you relax the mind, relax the body. And in that process of relaxation, what happens is mind opens up. And in that moment already experiences nibbana, experiences this process of spaciousness where there's nothing created, there's no formulation, it's just mind as it is. And then you generate something that's wholesome through the smile, and then you come back to your object, and then you repeat whenever necessary. So this is how we describe right effort, through this mnemonic device. And the more people do this, the more they realize, oh, I don't have to do anything here. All I have to do, I could save people 2 hours of Dharma
Right.
talks by just saying two things: observe and relax.
That's it.
That's really
Beautiful.
it.
That's it. It's fantastic. And really, because this is so important, Delson, I want to stick with it for just stick with it. Tricky word, sticking with it, right? But it's really interesting because to me, again, you mentioned Mahamudra Dzogchen, arguably in the Tibetan tradition, and I think that's why you're attracted to them, the fruitional most trajectories of the Kagyu and Nyingma traditions. And so to me, I love these fruitional approaches because what they argue, I wouldn't say argue, assert in let's bring it to your language, there is only nibbana, there is only nirvana, that's it. Or in Buddhist language, there's only the clear light mind, there's only the Dharmakaya, that's it. The issue is one of recognition. And I love this again because it bespeaks to the immediacy of the awakened state. That basically what samsara is either partial or complete non-recognition of what is always already right in front of you. And so it's like T.S. Eliot famously said in the Four Quartets, right? You return to where from where you began, but you see it as if for the first time. And so this ties in beautifully to what you were saying before about the path. And this is where our neuroscientist friend Ruben Laukkanen comes into play. That the path really, using the alliteration that what I call the 3Ds, you have the 6 Rs, I have the 3Ds. Number 1D is deceleration. That's the shamatha, the slowing down, putting the brakes, and B-R-A-K-E, B-R-E-A-K, double entendre intended, right? Deceleration leads to de-automatization. That's what you were talking about, the negation of reactivity, the increase of responsibility, basically de-automatizing, leading fundamentally to deconstruction. And so this is incredibly important also in a very practical way, because this stuff may sound really good on paper, but when we engage in the path and we start to deconstruct our self-sense and the world that arises co-emergently with it, well, from an egoic perspective, that's akin to death. And so this is where all the resistance to the path comes in, does it not? The
Yes.
fear, the anxiety. And so that's why the right view, first of the 8, arguably the most important, what we're talking about here, with the right view, not only will you better tolerate the mini death that's involved on this path, whether you know it or not, you've signed this death contract, and then also the view in the fruitional end. So I know I'm throwing a bunch of noodles on the wall here, but to me, this is so critically important, both in terms of setting the context and also, like you said, setting your mind in the right direction so that you know where you're going and what it is you're actually trying to accomplish. So say a little bit more about that, and also the atomistic nature is what my friend Evan Thompson, he coined this word. It's a wonderful word, quantum phenomenology. I love it. I love big words. But you get the idea, the mind that becomes so nuanced, so precise, so subtle, that all the things that the literature talks about that can seem almost philosophical rhetoric, this comes from Yogacara, comes from direct experience, from a mind that is so refined and precise that it actually discerns these atomistic qualities of reality. So talk to us a little bit about, anyway, whatever might react or respond to what I just threw out.
I'm glad you brought up that because that's something that I also teach, which is there is something to see, something that is the reactivity mindset, which is really the craving mindset. That is a mind which is, we talk about dependent origination, and it's interesting you talk about quantum phenomenology. That's a great way of looking at it.
Isn't that a great word?
Yeah, the one I call dependent origination quantum cognitics. That is to say, it's like it's a cascading of different things that lead to constructing your experience, right? So the idea here is there is reactivity and there's response. Reactivity, or reacting to situations, is rooted in that craving, in identification, in ignorance, in seeing things as me, mine, or myself in the wrong way, let's say, or in the ineffective way, in a way that leads to further suffering. Whereas the response or responsiveness is rooted in wisdom, rooted
Yes.
in compassion, rooted in real, true understanding of the nature of reality. And this happens as a result of seeing and deconstructing that quantum phenomenological state or different states, which is to say, now that you have the cessation of ignorance of these states, now you can be more mindful or be more aware as and when they arise, so that you can relax them.
Exactly.
So that you can let them go and then come to that nibbanic mindset, which is from where actually the mind in nibbana is spontaneous. Everything else that people react with is from all of this projection of different ideas that cascade down, whereas the nibbanic mind is spontaneous. It acts as it is required according to the situation and person that's there. But it will always, I tend to say, it will always respond in wisdom and with compassion.
And it does so because I think this is my languaging. I mean, this is where high five, my friend. We 100% agree. It's really the path from self-referential reactivity, which creates karma, to other referential or non-referential responsibility, which doesn't create karma. And I think this is also incredibly important to understand, because when you engage in the world with this kind of enlightened activism, this is cash value, street level important stuff, that when you act, I should say, respond and dance with your world in this capacity, it is effortless. There's no intentionality because there's no self-reference, hence there's no karma created. Therefore, you live, like Suzuki Roshi said in the Zen tradition, don't be a smoky bonfire, be a good bonfire. Cremate your experience as you live it. And the way you do that is reducing the craving or the contraction. That's a whole different topic I want to talk to you about. The craving, to me, is contraction. You replace the contraction with openness. And therefore, every action you take happens effortlessly, with a smile on your face, spontaneously, because you're in tune with the dictates of your reality. You're simply responding and acting as a representative of that reality because you're so open to it. You're such a good listener that reality tells you what to do. I mean, is that your experience? It seems like what you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I'm glad you brought up karma, because this is something that we look at in the form of, in again, going back to dependent origination. What we understand it even in the sutras or the Pali suttas, in the Nikayas, it mentions, there is something to be said about old karma and new karma. So everything that we're experiencing up until this present moment is an experience of old karma, or let's say the repercussions of karmic choices in the past that were rooted in ignorance, rooted in craving, rooted in this reactivity state of mind. But now there is a choice.
Can I ask you real quick, because I don't want to forget some of these. Is this what's referred to as vastu in the 12 links, Nadanas 1 through 7? This is what's given to you.
Right.
Is that correct? I just want to make sure we're...
Yeah, okay, so the ones that are given to you are basically ignorance, sankhara or formations, consciousness, nama rupa or mentality materiality, the sixth sense space, contact, and feeling. So exactly. Vedana, right? Vedana is basically this experience that you're having right now, in the present moment. Now, there's a choice here in the present moment. Do you want to add to that fuel, by reacting with ignorance, reacting with craving, reacting with this is me, this is mine, this is myself? Or do you see it as being a process that arose because of past causes and conditions that were impersonal, and therefore you respond in a way that lets go of that reactivity? Once you do that, then the new karma, which is the craving, the clinging, the becoming, the birth, and the jara marana, they don't come to be. So instead of adding to the repository, what's happening is the repository gets emptier and emptier with every succeeding experience of Vedana, with the proper wisdom that's attached to it or experiencing it.
That's fantastic. And so really, it's like I'm reminded of what James Joyce once said: history is a nightmare from which I'm trying to awake. We're trying to awake from this conditioning, basically the length nadanas 1 through 6, right? That's part of the history, the nightmare that conditions us. And this is where, of course, predictive processing and what all the neuroscientists have to say come into play. The wonderful marriage of deep contemplative insights, like you're talking about, and the contributions from the neuroscientific community.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and I would just add, you know, rebirth, for example, when we talk about jati or rebirth, what I say is rebirth is basically the same definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result.
Right.
So if you're going to continue being in a craving mindset, then you're just going to add to it. But if you have wisdom, then you're producing no new karma.
Exactly.
And that's the enlightened mind.
Exactly. And then see if, again, I want to test my understanding, is would it then be fair to say one of the contradistinctions, Delson, between the Buddhist tradition and others, which I don't mean to criticize in any way, is really not really getting out of rebirth, but getting out of involuntary rebirth. That's the way I see it. The rebirth itself is just the play of the mind. It's lila, rolpa. That's just what the mind does. That's never a problem. So the point is not to end rebirth. The point is to end involuntary, karmically driven, propulsive rebirth, taking now instead forming, and this is the 12 links, are the genius heuristic for this, right? Replace the first nadana, ignorance, with wisdom. The potter, the second nadana, then what does that do? That's still working. But instead of throwing ignorance into form, that'd be me, confused sentient being. Now you throw wisdom into form, and that's a tulku, a reincarnate, someone who comes back out of love and compassion, not out of ignorance, to be of service to reality. Is that a fair way to look at it from your understanding?
Yeah, it could be. And I would say that, yeah, that's a great way of looking at it, actually, because you talk about how ignorance is replaced by wisdom, right? And you touched upon right view just a few minutes ago. And I could also say that right view becomes the rudder. So, so right view is what then sort of, you could say, dictates, if you will, that enlightened mind in the sense that it becomes automatic. Right? Everything so far that beings do is automatically creating craving, automatically ignorant. But then when you let go of that and then you replace it with the wisdom, with the right view, then the mind becomes automatically wise, automatically compassionate. There's no effort to be made there.
Beautiful. It's like my languaging, instead of living our lives on automatic ignorance as we're automatons, right? Driven by automatic ignorance. Now we're living on automatic wisdom. And we know this is happening when we say that colloquially, like when we do something we shouldn't have done, we say, oh God, I just couldn't help myself. That's because of the power of your samskaras and your habits and your karma.
Yes.
Perhaps you want to get to the point where you act with love and kindness and compassion. And of course, you wouldn't say the following because you're humble, but you would also say, I couldn't help myself. I couldn't help myself but be loving. I couldn't help but be kind. Because that is now my default. That is now where that good karma or no karma now leads me from self-centricity to other centricity.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So oh my gosh, this is so rich. But we have to return to one thing. We left a little dangler here. Talk to us a little bit about the determinations, because this is something that is somewhat idiosyncratic to your tradition. There's not a lot of traffic with it in my tradition. And when I read it, I said, oh my gosh, I never really thought about it this way. I've had these colloquial experiences, like waking up in the middle of the night to catch a plane. That's an expression of determination.
Yes.
But more specifically, that's a very over-the-counter iteration. But more specifically, when you're engaging in Nirodha Samapatti, and I want to return to that, what ends it? why do you do it? Like what is the evolutionary purpose, Darwinian or spiritual, for doing something like this? And then what is the role of the determinations here? Because this is so fascinating. And this is something that my audience does not traffic in. So I really want to hear you riff on this.
Yeah, so determinations, this is something that later happened when, after my experiences with David Johnson at the online retreat, and I started doing more practice, he said, why don't you start getting to determinations? And it's a very sort of more of a technical meditative experience than anything else. So it's like you're refining and sharpening your ability to get into these jhanas. So, when you first begin work with these jhanas, you kind of stumble into them, and you kind of are like getting into them and understanding them a little bit, and then you get into the next one and the next one and so on, and it's all very naturally progressive. But determinations allows you to explore each territory of the jhana, as if they were rooms, and say, oh, here's this, here's that, oh, here's where the contact happens, here's the feeling, here's the perception, here's the intention, and so on. And as you're doing that, you get more well versed into the quality of each state of mind, the quality of each jhana. Now, specifically with determinations, that they have to do with duration. So the way I was trained by Bhante Villaramsi was, all right, so you get into this jhana and you explore it. You do the first jhana and you stay there for, let's say, 5 minutes. Stay there for 5 minutes. You tell your mind it'll go no higher than the first jhana. Stay there. And then once you're able to do that, stay there for, up to a minute and a half or something. And then you come in and out of jhana at micro levels. So you're like, I'll be in jhana for 3 seconds and then come out of it. I'll be in jhana for 5 seconds and then come out of it. So the idea is you're training your mind, or its ability, to be in a specific state of mind for a predetermined amount of time. And you do that through each of the jhanas 1 through 8. Let's say the first 4 jhanas, and then the 4 ayatanas, the 4 dimensions of experience. And then he tells you what you do is, okay, I want you to go from jhana 1 all the way to jhana 7, and then come back from jhana 7 and go down to jhana 3, and then go from jhana 3 and go to jhana 5, and so on and so forth. And when you do this, what it's doing is it's training your mind to be dexterous. This is really a technical experience. It's just refining your mind's ability to enter these samatha states, basically, and being able to just intentionalize, okay, I want to be here at this amount of time. Now, you mentioned, you could do this, and this is what we do on retreats. We tell people, like, all right, if you have to get up at 5:30 in the morning, let's say, make a determination, like, I'm going to get up at 5:25, and see how close to it that you get to it.
Yeah.
Or 5:31 or 5:32 or something like that. And this is just the precursor to training the mind to be able to do that. Now, not a lot of people do this within the tradition. I know of a few people who do it, but ultimately the idea is you get from this and then be able to determine how long you want to be in Nirodha Samapati for. So Nirodha Samapati is the attainment of the cessation of perception, feeling, and consciousness. And you can get there, and then you can be there for up to a minute, or you can be there up to 7 days. That's the Pali Nikaya understanding, is that you can be in this state where there's utterly no feeling, no perception, no consciousness going on for up to 7 days. And what I joke, I say the reason, what is the benefit of doing that?
Right.
And I say it's bragging rights. It's bragging rights.
Oh, there you go. I was going to say, I love it. High five, my friend. And it's like, what would Darwin say to this? What would again? It's fantastic. I love this stuff. So yeah, keep running with it.
But the reason why you do it is really, you think about all experience that you have. Even though the mind is in a state of nibbana, it's in a state of not conceptualizing, not creating, not formulating. The 6 sense bases are continuously experiencing things through sensory data packets. So the idea is that in cessation of perception, feeling, and consciousness, the 6 sense bases are inactive. So the impediments, let's say, of those sensory data packets don't continue. So there's a sense of relief from that. And so one of the things that people see is when they come out of cessation, It's like their eyes can take in more information.
Mm,
Their ears can take in more information.
mm,
The colors become brighter.
yeah.
The lights are just more luminous, and so on and so forth. So in the Pali Nikayas, it says the faculties are serene and clear, which means that they're clear because there's no, let's say, dirt of sensory packet information that's
Beautiful.
happening in cessation of perception, feeling, and consciousness.
So what comes to mind is Huxley's famous, beautiful term from the Perennial philosophy. The brain is a reducing valve. And it's also somewhat indicative to me, Delson, of this narrative of progressive opening, that really on one level, if we meaning ego, the reference stance, the developmental stance, that's what ego is to me. It's just an arrested form of development. We need the ego on one level, or otherwise we wouldn't be here talking about egolessness. It's a necessary part of evolution. So don't get rid of it, transcend but include it. But what ego does is it acts as a reducing valve, because if ego saw reality the way it really is, it would incinerate. In other words, the sensory input, the amount of reduction that in the sciences tell us this, 1 part per million, right? What we reduce allows us to negotiate, again, Darwinian, in the world in order to survive. But this is survival at a biological evolutionary Darwinian way. We're talking about post-Darwin evolution,
Yes.
where evolution continues, right? As Chardin said, but now it's just moved indoors. It's moved at the level of mind and heart. That's what evolves. So the same parameters and metrics that we used vis-a-vis Lamarck and Darwin and others no longer apply for spiritual evolution. And in fact, I would argue that this is one reason spiritual evolution is so difficult, because we have a biological, even genetic legacy burned into our DNA that actually is working against us on the spiritual path. Hence, fear that is so critical in biological evolution becomes a massive retardant in spiritual evolution. And so I'm curious if that lands with you as well, because again, this has cash value for me, Delson, because it helps us understand, my languaging, the forces of the dark side, right? There you go.
Right.
The forces of
Yeah.
the dark side. Our histories, our conditioning, our ignorance, individual, societal, collective, even scientific, the legacies, all the massive forces of the dark side that co-conspire to keep us so in the dark, so afraid.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a wonderful way of looking at it, because spiritual evolution, as it were, is really about, as I understand it, a process of it's a process of up more to reality, rather than, as you said, in the biological perspective. It's like you need a sense of salience, so you can only target what you require for your particular needs. You pick out this because it satisfies the craving mindset. So the way I look at it is, the idea of the craving mindset is, all right, there's an agitation that happens in the body, in the nervous system, once it requires either that it's hungry, which is that the mindset of attachment, that I need something in order to satisfy me, or I'm in danger, so I need to run away from this, or I need to push this away. So that's the aversive quality of the mind. Or I am this, I'm standing my ground, and I'm saying that this is me, this is mine, this is myself. That's that sort of state of mind, let's say the fight or flight kind of state of mind, let's say, right? That is really the tension that happens in the nervous system. And it's that contraction that you were referring to, or at least that's where I would understand it,
Yeah.
is that contraction that is physically felt in some ways if you're really attuned to it. Now, this is where, the old model, let's say the samsaric model, will say that, okay, I experience this craving, or I experience this aversion, or I experience this identification. But if I feed into my craving, or if I feed into my aversion, or if I feed into my identification, I experience some level of relief. Now there's a bit of an expansion of the nervous system, because I was really hungry and I went for that piece of chocolate cake. I ate that piece of chocolate cake and I felt really satisfied, and now I feel relief. But there's another model here, which is the Nibbanic model, which is saying, what if you could experience relief without having to act upon the craving, without
Absolutely.
having to act upon
Yep.
the aversion and
Yep.
identification?
Yep.
So the idea here is the relief is experienced even before the craving arises,
Yep.
so that the craving never even has to arise.
Beautiful. Talk about cash value. But we can't let this word get out, Delson, because it would crash the world's economy. I mean, really, think about it. This is my languaging around this. And I mean, I'm so in resonance with you here. Is that, again, if we take a very close look, and that's the invitation, the empirical scientific invitation of these traditions. The Buddha said it, don't take my teachings on face value. Look at your own experience, test my teachings against your experience, work out your own salvation with diligence. So he's saying, be a good first person scientist, look at yourself. And so for me, like you, I like to look at things very, very closely. And when I look at things like craving, I actually see, and this is a way perhaps to summarize of what you just said, when I look at it in an unexamined way, I think I'm happy when I get what I want. And that right there is the basis of the obesity epidemic at every level. Physical obesity, intellectual obesity, spiritual obesity, all the ways that we just consume because we think we're happy when we get what we want. Not quite. If you take a closer look, we're actually happy when we stop wanting. So in other words, we confuse the satisfaction of want with its temporary transcendence. So why not reduce life to its closest irreducible terms and realize the phenomenology, the mechanics of desire? And exactly like you said, you already have what you want. Just discover it, remove the adventitious defilements, and realize you don't have to trash this planet. The average American, Delson, consumes over 200 times the world's average of natural resources. And it's all reducible to this marikpa, this lack of knowing, this ignorance. So less people listening go, oh, this is just philosophy or spiritual rhetoric. Oh my goodness, this is a game changer for the way you live your life. It's like I playfully say, is a Marie Kondo for your mind, right? Remember Marie Kondo?
Yeah.
You're not just cleaning up your closet, you're simplifying and cleaning up your whole life if you understand the phenomenology of happiness. And that's really what you're talking about here.
Yes.
Right? So
Yes,
anyways,
absolutely.
it's like you're interviewing me. I get so excited when I talk to people like you. I have to back off. But let's come back. I want to hear some more stories because are we okay? Can I return to some stories?
Yeah. Go ahead.
So you talked earlier about memory, and it's so interesting, this memory thing. You have a tremendous capacity to recollect. And so again, if you don't want to go here, I'm happy to set any of these questions aside. But you share a story. When I heard it, I have to say I just giggled in delight. It was like, this is the most amazing story. So as one's distraction diminishes, distraction is another way to talk about forgetfulness. As we become more mindful, we become more aware, our memory naturally increases. My understanding, Buddhas are never distracted. Buddhas never forget. Buddhas never sleep. In that sense, we'll come back to that in a second. And so memory also in our traditional understanding increases. We have an increased prodigious capacity to recall. In Tibetan, the word for mindfulness is drempa, literally means to recollect, to remember. So when you do enough memory muscle, whatever, we remember more and more. So talk to us, share with us this remarkable story that I can't remember where I heard it, whether it was from Liam or somewhere else, about your recollection of your previous life in the whole wedding thing. Because when I heard that, Delson, it was just, I just jumped up and down in delight. It's such an awesome story. So are you okay sharing
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's basically, I was doing another practice, which is known as the threefold knowledge. So in the Pali tradition, let's say we have the threefold knowledge, which is number one, being able to recollect your past lives. Number two, being able to see the arising and passing away of other beings in different dimensions. And then the third is really seeing the destruction of all ignorance and craving and so on and so forth. So in the first knowledge, you actually there's a way of doing it, which is you go into what's known as the fourth jhana, where you have complete equanimity, and you place your mind towards what happened the day before, and you continue going all the way to different aspects of your life. And you start to see, all the way up to when you were an infant, and you go beyond, and there's this blank spot, and then you start off in the next life, and you start to see things. And though the experience is like, if there's anyone who remembers, it's like, when you have the VCR, the videotape, and you're rewinding, and you see, the people going back in reverse, and then you stop at a point and you start to see that play out, because it's some kind of karmic, it has some kind of karmic resonance to a lot of the choices that you're making in your present life. So with that background, or with that foundation, so I did that. And in my previous life, what I saw was that I was this yogi, a wandering yogi in the Himalayas. And I was traveling all around India. And I came across where there was this huge, celebration going on. People were enjoying themselves. And I was thinking what was going on. And here is a wedding. There is this couple that was just newly married, and they invited me come and have a meal. They said, please have a meal with us. And so I did, and I was so happy. I was so delighted. I blessed them, and I said, you'll have a son. You'll be blessed with a son. And I left, and then I went back, and I went to the forest, and I departed, meaning I left the body. Now, my mother and my father, uh, they they actually met somebody who was a yogi, who came to the wedding, and they invited him to come and have a meal. So when I went to them and I told them, and I asked them, so at your wedding, was there anybody who was a yogi, or like a ascetic or a sadhu, who, that you might have met at your wedding? And they said, yeah, he was there at the reception. But who told you this? Was it your grandmother who told you this? Or, how did you get to know this? Because they had never told me about this. And so, in essence, when I blessed them with a son, I was just blessing them with this present, let's say, mind body that you see before me and before you. So that's the story. I mean, I knew my parents before I was born as their child.
So what was their reaction outside of their jaws hitting the floor? I mean, what?
Well, they don't know exactly that I know about that particular yogi, in the sense that I was that yogi.
I see.
Right. If I told them that, I don't think they would still be flabbergasted. My mom would still be flabbergasted.
Right.
But maybe I should bring it up to her and say, the reason I know this is because this is the experience I had, because she's very open to these kinds of things. And I've had other experiences where I've seen, let's say, other realms or other dimensions and other things that are going on in this universe. I don't know what's that famous line from Hamlet where Horatio says there are more, more wonders in heaven and earth than we know of, and so on.
You can even imagine.
But yeah.
And so again, to me, Delson, this is just so beautiful, because again, it flows in so elegantly to this narrative of opening, that on one level we think of these as cities, they're these miraculous powers, but on another level, they're a natural consequence of just being so open. That as we become translucent and transparent to ourselves, we become translucent, transparent, porous to reality. And therefore, it's only because we're so constipated, so contracted, so shut down, that we don't acknowledge the actual normalcy of these types of experiences. We think of these psychic relative cities, these extraordinary events, but on one level, they're extraordinary. They're not extraordinary, they're extraordinary. Right. And what I love about the way you deliver this with such humor, self-effacement, and candor, it's just like talking about how you took the garbage out this morning. And to me, that really is really quite delightful, because otherwise, as you put it, the bragging rights around this stuff can become somewhat of an issue, right? And so I very much appreciate that. One small follow-up. In the tradition that I follow, the Tibetan Buddhists, they, as you know, they have a massive corpus literature on what are called the bardo teachings, the transitional teachings, the gap teachings. And you mentioned very briefly earlier this notion of the gaps in your experiences, the kind of atomistic nature. That's bardo principle in a microcosmic form. But I spend a lot of time really exploring these teachings and working with teachers. You mentioned going back in memory in this life all the way up into a blank spot. And so to me, blank spot seemed to intimate bardo. So in your tradition, in your understanding and experience, recollection, what happens both doctrinally and experientially for you in that gap? Not just between
That's
thoughts
a
and
good
moments, but
point.
now gap in life.
Between lifetimes,
Yeah,
let's say, yeah. And that's another way of looking at dependent origination. And so, we look at dependent origination on multiple levels. One is the micro quantum level of day-to-day or moment-to-moment experience, and then on the behavioral level of where you're interacting with people. But then there's the cosmic or the macro level, which is from one lifetime to another, let's say. And so the way that I've explained this from the context of dependent origination and from my own experience of seeing this, I see the bardos as something that is definitely valid, whether it's dependent tradition
sure.
or whether it's a Theravada tradition. Maybe there might be difference in how it's experienced, but I do see that there is something going on here. And so when we talk about dependent origination, or from the context of dependent origination, that blank spot is really not a blank spot,
Right.
right? I mean, if I go back to that experience, it's more than a blank spot.
Mm,
There is something going on there, and
mm,
what's going on there is a what I would say is like a karmic refueling spot,
mm,
right? It's where what's happening is certain things come up in the form of images, in the form of experiences, in the form of maybe memories, in the form of people, or different kinds of visions and things that come up, and how the mind takes it. So if the mind identifies with it, if the mind has craving for it, or if the mind has aversion towards it, fear for it, then or fear from it, then there's a fuel for karma to arise.
mm.
And that fuel and that fueling process is where this blank spot is, this so-called blank spot is there. So it's where you go from the arising of a new consciousness, a new vijnana that arises,
Mhm,
and then departs from the old nama rupa, the
mm,
old mentality
mhm,
materiality,
mhm,
and then descends into a new mentality
mhm,
materiality, right? So that dissension is that process from the awakening from or coming out of the old namarupa and then coming into the new namarupa. That whole process is dependent upon that karmic fueling process, that
beautiful.
karmic refueling process, which is how I understand the bardos. So when my father passed away recently. He passed
Oh, I'm
away in
sorry.
February,
I'm sorry.
and I was with him when he passed away, and so I had a lot more insight into the dying process in that moment, because I saw that actually what we call as the dying process or the death process isn't just medical, in the sense that it's just the stopping of respiration, the stopping of the heart, and the stopping of brain activity. Actually, something is still going on beyond that.
Mm,
So what's going on there is, when what we consider to be the dying process or the death, the official death, the minute of death, there's actually still some stuff going on. And the
totally.
stuff that's going on, the way I explain it to students is that, we talk about the four elements, the four great, elements,
Touches.
which
Yeah.
are the fire and the earth energy, the fire energy, the water energy, the air energy. And the way it looks like it in the dying process is the air energy diminishes first,
Hmm.
then the fire energy diminishes, then the water energy, and then finally the earth energy. But also, the six sense bases are active for a little while,
Hmm. Hmm.
even after the dying process, which means the first thing that goes away is your sense of smell, then your sense of taste, then your sense of sight, then your sense of touch, and then your sense of hearing. Which means for those people who, let's say, they're going through a process where people they love and are close to them are dying, stay with them after they're medically dead and say good things to them, guide them
Hmm.
to a better rebirth, because they're
Absolutely.
still there in the way of their senses. And then finally the mind goes away. But while the mind is active, that's where the bardo is being experienced. That's where the karmic refueling is being experienced, where they're seeing certain visions, they're seeing certain experiences, and if there's craving there, new consciousness arises, departs from there, and then that's technically the official death. And then there's the arising of a new birth, when that consciousness descends into a new nama rupa.
Yeah, that, I mean, that's really, really fantastic. And you may know, Delson, in the Tibetan tradition, there's a really interesting phenomena that's actually now being studied scientifically at the request of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. It's called tukdam, which is literally post-death meditative absorption, where these great siddhas can maintain meditative equipoise for weeks after
Right.
death. They're clinically dead, but they do they don't decompose. Excuse me. There's no odor. It really just looks like they're sleeping. It doesn't look like they're dead, because the mind, what's called the bindu, excuse me, is still in the body. It's still in the heart center, the provisional location of the ultimate dharmakaya, dharmata. And so these are again, it's a wonderful dance between spirituality and science now that scientists, I'm involved a little bit as a consultant here. Scientists are now studying this phenomena, which I wouldn't say if, it's when this data is collected, this is how paradigms change. These are revolutions in the mind sciences when you collect hardcore data that does not fit into the preceding paradigm. And so this leads into a wonderful segue of, if you're comfortable talking to me a little bit about the study you did in the Netherlands with sleep, because not only am I deeply interested in the bardos, but part of my real interest are what I call the 5 nocturnal meditations. This is my languaging for 5 successive ways to work in a quantum phenomenological way with what is usually just lights off. You know, the West has a light switch model: on, off, dead, alive, yes, no, black, white. Well, my experience, and I think yours, is these traditions replace the Western light switch model with a dimmer. It's not on, off. You're just dimming gross to subtle to very subtle. And so really, awareness of absence is not absence of awareness. Just because you're blacking out, it doesn't mean that you're completely offline. It's just your exclusive identification with form doesn't recognize the formless. Yeah. So with your kind permission, talk to us a little bit about the study you did in the Netherlands with sleep. I can't wait to see the data. And then if you're, again, comfortable with this, I personally, for one, would love to hear, if you can share with us, what is it like for you when you fall asleep and your journey through the night? Because according to the Tibetan approach, you intimated what philosophers refer to as the theory of recapitulation, which is the iterative nature of what takes place between the rising and abiding of every thought, every life, every day. There is this kind of, it's called self-similarity that takes place between all these different states. And so therefore, in the Tibetan tradition, Delson, as you know, you can use the nocturnal display of the mind as a concordant experience, as like a dress rehearsal for what they allegedly will say at the dream at the end of time when you die. So dream yoga came about largely to prepare for death. Yeah. So a couple of things there. Tell us a little bit about the study in the Netherlands, and then also, if you would, describe for us what it's like when you go to sleep and what actually occurs to you as you turn the dimmer down every night.
Yeah. So yeah, the sleep study was part of the larger study, which was relating to studying Nirodha. So what they wanted to see was, is there a difference between Nirodha and the states of sleep that the mind experiences? So this was part of the study, but a different study research team. And Ruben was actually there while that was happening as well. So they had me actually, they had a really nice room set up, and it was a nice bed where I could just take a nap. And then they were studying, okay, just the waking state of mind. What is that like? And starting to see what's happening there. Then going into sleep, what's happening over there. And then studying what are the stages of sleep that are experienced in that mind, and then coming back out. And then they had me again be in the waking state, then go into Nirodha, and then come out. So in the first part of the study, when I was, they saw the waking state, then they saw me going to sleep. When I came back out from the nap, they asked me, were you actually asleep? Because your initial brain readings, or the brainwave readings, suggest that you were still awake. And I said, no, I was in deep sleep, but I was conscious. I was aware of being in deep sleep. That's really what was going on. Because what they said was, there are certain spindles in the waves, waveforms,
spindles,
which suggests that there's deep sleep going on. But this is not present where the mind fell asleep. The mind was asleep, but it didn't fall asleep as such. So later on, some of the initial data that came out, it showed that in the waking state, there was a lot of delta activity going on anyway, right? And then the sleep phase actually showed that the mind was alert and awake.
Beautiful.
And so it was almost like a converse of what you would expect. It was like you would expect some kind of alertness and then some kind of low activity going on in sleep. But here, the waking state, in my experience, in my subjective experience, is that the mind is always just calm and collected and nothing going on as such. And then in deep sleep, nothing's going on, but there's still alertness there. So when I go to sleep, uh, and I close my eyes and I fall asleep, I'm not falling asleep. It's just the mind goes into rest and there's an awareness there. So, I could also contextualize it from that model of, you talk about it in Advaita Vedanta, which is you have the waking state, you have the
Yep.
Shushupti, which is, the deep sleep state, the dreaming state, and then the deep sleep state. Now,
True.
in my experience, I don't really have dreams going on. I'm aware of how the transition happens. And there's just an experience of neither perception nor non-perception. That experience of the eighth jhana is going on. And then the mind is just aware, but there's no awareness of anything. It's not even awareness of nothing. It's just a objectless awareness, if you will.
And so this is so fascinating to me. So again, this is my languaging, and let me see if this resonates with you. So there's this kind of tacit awareness that, like you said, that is I mean, I suppose you could call it non-dualistic awareness. There's still awareness, but it's objectless. In other words, you're actually not aware of, it's aware as. So awareness, basically, in Tibetan, Rangbop, the mind falls into itself. And therefore it rests in this ultimate formless awareness, which is really what fundamentally, I think you might agree with me, this is fundamentally what we really want irreducibly, is to rest in this absolute dimension of awareness. It's what we lose during the day. So you rest in this tacit, formless, non-dualistic awareness. And so therefore, in a certain way, you don't really lose, well, actually, I suppose you could say technically you lose consciousness, but you don't lose awareness. In other words, if you use consciousness in the Sanskrit, vijnana is a kind of pejorative dualistic term because consciousness denotes the duality, that implodes, disappears, or whatever. But again, don't let me put words in your mouth, but what I'm hearing is then that there's this underlying tacit awareness that you fall into, you descend into, that remains kind of like the 7-Eleven awareness, right? It's the awareness that's on all the time.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
That's absolutely right. And the only difference is how the experience of that awareness is. That is to say, in the waking state, let's say, there's just an experience of this world, this reality that we experience through the six sense bases. But then in the sleep state, there's nothing going on. There's just mind. Just mind. Beautiful. Resting in mind. That's it.
Beautiful. And so talk to us a little bit about, because again, in the Yogacara tradition, which is, it's one of the most sophisticated Indian philosophies ever to come out of India. And I'm a huge fan of the Yogacara. I love their descriptions of mind and reality. And they talk about, as you know, the substrate consciousness, the alaya vijnana, the storehouse. And then fundamentally, that when that storehouse consciousness is depleted, that's the repository for the bakchak, the samskaras, all the latent karmic predispositions. On one level, when that is empty, dreams, naroda, there's no dreams, dreams stop. There's a cessation of dreams. And so my languaging, and I'm curious how this lands with you, two questions. One is say a little bit more about that experience or lack thereof of the dream. There's no dreams. Another way to say this for me, Delson, again, question, to me, another way to say this is to also say everything becomes a dream. So in a certain way, you stop dreaming, but everything becomes a dream, because for me, dream is code language for manifestation of awareness, for manifestation of mind. And that is what, in fact, the Buddha woke up from, right? He woke up from the nightmare of reified samsara. He woke up to the empty dreamlike nature of nirvana. So he woke up to the fact that everything is a dream. Does that languaging work with you? I'm
That
curious.
completely resonates, actually. There's another monastic named Punaji. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he
I'm
was a
not.
friend of Bhante Vimalaramsi, and he said enlightenment is basically awakening from the dream of existence,
Yeah, beautiful.
right? So
Yeah.
I completely resonate with that, which is you awaken from this slot and torpor, if you will, of individualized identification with something that is basically conditioned to something that is unconditioned and always fresh in that sense, always spontaneous. And it's just something that is, it's not the arising of anything, actually. It's the complete cessation of
Yes.
experience.
Beautiful. Beautiful. And again, this is where we have to talk about quantum phenomenology, because this is where we have to be very specific and articulate, even with the languaging that we're using.
Yeah.
Because when you're talking about the cessation of experience, that can easily slip into some nihilistic, like, oh, this is you just turning into a zombie. This is where the difference in Buddhist languaging, experience like consciousness always has a slight pejorative tinge. It's replaced, transformed with realization, where there's still something, it's just not a thing.
Yes.
And therefore existence in the reified sense as we know it, which defines samsara, that's been erased, that's been negated. And then what's left is, of course, this ineffable formless that is so hard to put into words, non-experience, what we know as the realization of the awakened state. Right. So for someone like you, and again, don't let me put words in your mouth, lucid dreaming no longer has applicability in your nocturnal arena because there's no dreams display of mind to transform, to work with. However, what does speak to me, or I'd be curious to see what your response is, what the Tibetans talk about is Ursal yoga, luminosity yoga, sleep yoga, where in a certain way that is the penultimate nocturnal practice. Lucid dreaming is a subset of sleep yoga, luminosity yoga. And therefore, to me, when I hear you say this to me sounds like the fruition of actually luminosity yoga, this kind of black light of non-dualistic awareness. So can you actually put descriptive terms to what that so-called experience, quote unquote, is like? So that in fact, the reason I mention this, Delson, is I believe people actually have this experience, quote unquote, but may not recognize it. What the philosophers talk about is the difference between access and phenomenal consciousness, that you can actually experience something, but not be able to track it and access it into conscious awareness. So that's why this is not just a philosophical issue. It could be helpful for people to say, oh my gosh, whoa, now that Delson's saying this, I'm having something like that. I never really thought of it this way before. So
yeah, I mean, I can contextualize it from my experience of what I see it as, or how I experience it from also, let's say, our Pali tradition, which is, it is that mind or that experience, if you will, that is what's known as signless, undirected, and empty. Okay. And the reason is because it's not an object in of itself. You can't put the mind to it.
right.
It just is. You can't make it into an object.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
and the reason is because all objects ultimately are conditioned. All objects ultimately therefore are impermanent, and therefore the mind doesn't want to hold on to anything. It doesn't hold on anymore to anything whatsoever. It's undirected because it understands that directing the mind anywhere, even to this experience, which you can only relax into it, actually.
Right,
You can only
exactly.
allow the mind to open up to it. But directing the mind asserts the idea that there is something that is quantifiably or qualitatively a source of happiness. But if everything is conditioned, then it is impermanent, and therefore it is liable to cause suffering in one way or another, liable to cause dukkha in one way or another. So for that reason, the mind doesn't direct it to anywhere, it just relaxes, lets go of any expectations of what it could be or what it couldn't be. And then finally, it's empty because it's empty of self, empty of anything that can be seen as me, mine, or myself.
Beautiful.
So it just is. It just is an experience, if you want to talk about it in language. And this is
Right.
where language gets difficult, right?
It
I mean,
falls
you can
apart. Yep.
only point to the moon, but if you pay attention only to the finger, then you're missing the whole point. So the language is only pointing to what that experience is. It's only pointing to that particular framework of reality, if you will. So it is, as I would call it, it is something that is unconditioned. I mean, it has no conditions at all. It's unconstructed. So your objective, if you will, the mission here for anybody here, if you will, is not to construct it, not to go to it,
Right.
not to become it, not to be it. It is just, it is there. It just relax into it.
Hence the irreducible really instruction of recognition and relaxation. You know, as they say over and over in the Bardo, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which is really, if you've read it, it's a code language for a book of life, right?
Yeah.
Recognition and liberation are simultaneous. Recognition is really the key point. You already are a Buddha. You just don't remember. These teachings jog your memory. You're already in a pure land. You just need to recognize. This is nirvana. You just need to recognize. So this returns again to the empowerment of the utter immediacy of the awakened state. That yes, on one level, because of the profound mechanisms of relative reality, karma, samskara, all the things that the 12 links describe with such elegance and force, that's still relative truth. On one level, it's basically just the evaporation of that, recognizing, opening, realizing it's right here and right now. And so Delson, talk to us if you would. I find this so inspiring, by the way, because I work a lot in this world. How did this skill set in the nocturnal mind, in the nocturnal meditations, what you're just describing, take place? Was this running correlative and concurrent to your experience of the jhana states? Or how like, when did it start coming about? Like, what were you doing in your daily life that either facilitated that, or was it more kind of serendipitous, just karmic unfolding based on your predispositions and skill sets?
You know, I would say that it started to happen, it's sort of like towards the year 2020. Like it started to really become more and more apparent. And the reason I'm saying that is because I've had different cessation experiences that have led to, quote unquote, nibbanic experiences that allow the mind to let go of certain defilements and so on. But as those defilements were being let go of, and once the mind was rid of certain defilements, the mindfulness, the by the way, you mentioned mindfulness as being a form of remembering, a form of
Recollection.
recollecting. That's the
Yeah.
way we see it here as well. It's sati. Sati is
Yeah.
coming from the word smriti in
To
Sanskrit,
remember.
which means memory, to remember. So as your mindfulness becomes much clearer, it is actually becoming even more mindful of the different shades of experience that are happening in sleep, the variances that are happening. And eventually, as it becomes more stabilized in that, then you see that even dreams are seen as just illusions, right? They're just seen as Maya. They're seen as certain things that are arising because of samskaras,
Yep.
because of sankharas. And then when you have an experience where the mind becomes fully void of certain samskaras. So the way to look at it is that in the relative experience, such a mind will still go through the links of dependent origination. However, like we said, there's no more ignorance. So there's only right view or wisdom arising. And so any formations that arise as a result of the cascading of old karma that is yet to be experienced.
Mm.
That is why this mind and body are still here, because there's still fuel from previous
Mm.
karma that still needs to be experienced based on previous choices prior to that experience of, let's say, full awakening. And so anything that arises, then that consciousness that arises is void of any defilements. It's just clear consciousness that is rooted in wisdom. And then anything that arises in the form of contact and feeling is seen for what it actually is, which is not me, not mine, not myself.
Yeah.
This is the reality of the situation. And so because of that, there's no fuel for new karma. So the only active links that are there present in such a mind are wisdom, replacing ignorance, formations or samskaras, the consciousness of vijnana, nama rupa, mentality, materiality, the six sense spaces, contact, and feeling. And that's it.
That's it. Yeah, that's beautiful. So what you said earlier, Delson, is this one way to make the distinction between nirvana and parinirvana? That at least in my tradition, that you've crossed the finish line, so to speak, but you've been running so fast, right? It takes a while until you hit ground zero, so to speak.
Yeah.
So is that your understanding of the difference between nirvana and parinirvana? That at the moment of death, when this karma that's embodied in this bhava samskara, right, this form, when that's exhausted, then that's parinirvana, that's the complete cessation, complete arhatship.
Yes, yes, I would agree with that completely, because it's the momentum of karma that keeps this body running,
That's
this
right.
mind body running. So, we have stories in the Pali tradition of, let's say, the arahats who had to face a lot of, let's say, unwholesome karma, only because of choices that they made in the past. It wasn't because of new karma that they created. They're just having to deal with the storehouse or the repository of old karma.
Exactly.
And then parinibbana happens when the fuel is completely spent.
And that point, then, like we talked about earlier, then when one comes back, it's voluntarily driven by love and compassion, and instead of involuntary impulses. And so with this in mind, again, just so you know, one of the things that my community is doing, we're going to be starting hopefully the end of this year, quite a rigorous systematic preparation for end of life and death, using the Tibetan template of the Bardo teachings. And so let's talk just a little bit about what you anticipate will happen, because again, right view here is everything, right? The reason we're so afraid of death is because we're always afraid of what we don't know. Ignorance and fear are virtually synonymous. So even at the level of the map, beautiful teachings and teachers that represent it like yourself, this can transform obstacle into opportunity. And instead of approaching the end of life looking through the rear view mirror, which causes so much suffering, we actually have something to look forward to, like parinirvana at best, enlightenment. So talk to us a little bit about the power of right view as you've come to understand it and experience it in relationship to the end of life, how you might be working with that if you are with your student population. And then again, in a personal way, if it lands with you, what do you expect or know when you look towards the end of your life, when this Delson, this particular costume, right? This Delson costume is taken off. What do you expect? What do you think will happen when you transition?
Yeah, so let's unpack that. So first of all, I think, Bhante Vimalaramsi, for example, and that's really what inspires a lot of the students, is that before he was a monk, I believe, he would go into hospices and he would spend time with the dying, and he would actually go with them and kind of guide them into a more uplifted state of mind.
Beautiful.
And that could have been through reading, religious stories based on their particular tradition. So it was reading stories from the Bible, reading stories from the Quran, or whatever it might have been for that particular individual. So it's important to understand that, you can guide a person towards a better existence in the future if you keep their mind uplifted. When the fear arises, when the anxiety arises, when anger arises, regret arises, remorse arises, you can take those and you can flip them by trying to remind them of the good things that they've done in their life. Remind them of all of the times they've been generous. Remind them of all of the things that you're grateful for the things that they did for you. So they start to avert their mind towards that. And by averting their mind towards that, the samskaras that arise allow for the fuel of new consciousness to be rooted in something that is uplifted and wholesome. So there's a key sutra in the Pali tradition known as Anathapindika Sutta, and it's in the Majjhima Nikaya. It's 143. And in there, it's Sariputta, who's going through the dying process, or going through a process of uh, creating the situations for this particular person, Anathapindika, who's dying, in his mind to start to experience Nibbana. So what he says is I mean, I'll paraphrase, but it's a big sutta. But the summary of that is he allows the mind not to land on anything. So my consciousness will not be dependent upon the six sense bases. My consciousness will not be dependent upon my memories, will not be dependent upon my remorse and regret, will not be dependent upon this and that and so on. And so when there is this unestablished consciousness, that is Nibbana, that is the experience of Nibbana. So that allows him to see that. And yes, he does take new rebirth, but he takes rebirth in the Tusita heaven, where then he comes back as a deva and so on. So that's the rest of the story. So what I'm getting at is for this particular group of people who might be interested in helping people in the dying process, is to allow them to allow their minds to be uplifted. So keep reminding them of the wholesome things. And if you think that they're okay with it, to guide them through a process of letting go, of relaxing, and identifying with anything that's going on. Yeah. Now, as for, let's say, the end of this life, if I were to explain it from the context of the Theravada tradition, the idea is that there is no new rebirth consciousness that arises. And so the fuel is spent. Now, the idea in the Pali tradition is there was such a person who basically, when they departed, there was this black smoke around them. And the Buddha points out to it, and he says to his students, he says, "Do you see that, monks? Do you see that black smoke?" And they said, "Yes." And he says, "That is Mara looking for the new consciousness of that being, but unable to find it happening. So there will be no new arising of rebirth consciousness that will happen."
Wow. And so again, you don't need to go here. So then what becomes of you? Where sometimes these are, and again, I apologize in advance, these pedestrian, colloquial, and sometimes really just kind of stupid questions. But these are the kind of questions that the people listening to this are going to say that this is what they're thinking, right?
Right.
What's going to happen to Delson? Is he just going to merrily into infinity as this little, spirit nymph or whatever?
Yeah.
So what are you, quote unquote, going to do?
Well, again, I'll tell you this. We talked about a little earlier. We talked about how this experience is awakening from the dream of existence, right? Yeah. Awakening from that. So that awakening also makes you realize that there never was a you to begin with.
There you go.
So if there was never a you to begin with, how can there be a you to end with?
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, high five. That's just fantastic. So with your permission, Delson, if we have time, there's two small areas I want to go into a little bit more before we close. This is incredibly rich and rewarding. A little bit about, if you would, you're unusual on a number of levels, but one is your willingness, capacity to work with science, the scientific community, and to allow yourself to be sort of subjected, you know what I mean, to enter these labs and to really serve as kind of a mental Olympian, someone who has these unique capacities through all these predispositions and whatnot. That's fantastic. Tell us a little bit about, why do you do this? What inspires you to work with the scientific community? What are your aspirations going forward? And again, I love science. If I had to do it all over again, I would probably be a neuroscientist. I hang a lot with these sorts of people. I'm super interested in this. And as you know, there's a really quite a cadre of quite sophisticated scientists, thinkers now, who are really opening their hearts, minds to a certain extent to explore really outliers like yourself, where you have these unique capacities that really start to stretch and eventually bust paradigms. So talk to us a little bit about your interest in science, why you work with them, your aspirations going forward with interfacing with the scientific community, because this is a massive contribution. This is the vocabulary of the West, right? These are the arbiters of truth in the Western world. These are the high priests for many people. So talk to us a little bit about the relationship of science in your path.
You know, if I remember correctly, I think there was some time at one point, the Dalai Lama said something like this. He said that if science were to somehow disprove something that was there in Buddhism, then we would have to rethink what we're talking about in Buddhism. And I have that same sort of attitude, let's say, is to say, I have these subjective experiences of jhanas and nirodha samapatti and all these other things. But if science can somehow, because we have certain understandings within the Pali tradition that nirodha samapatti means that there's something going on, but none of these things are going on. But if science says something else, then we have to take a look again and revise possibly those suggestions or those experiences that are talked about in the traditions. And I'm also doing it I'm also looking at it from the perspective of inspiring future generations, because now future generations are very much, let's say, going to be rooted in the material realm of existence. They're very much rooted in, okay, can you prove it to me? Show me how the science works. And that category of people, not that everybody's going to be like that, but that category of people can be inspired by seeing that provable data, if you will, so that's another, let's say, motivation for why I'm doing this. And ultimately, it's to meet cool scientists like Ruben, and being able to hang out with them.
Yeah, they're really inspiring, especially the younger generation. There's some great, wonderful stalwarts like Richie Davidson and his whole team, and Tom Metzinger and the philosophy. There's some really interesting people, but the younger ones, to me, like you, I'm so inspired by their capacities, their passion for really being open to explore these types of things. Because as you know, it's not a classic characteristic of the scientific mind to be open, right? Almost by definition, they're closed, reified entities, and they're not interested in these sort of things. So are you, and I say this with some, I could help in this regard. We could talk behind the scenes on this, because I'm pretty dialed into this community. Aspirations for future research. How willing are you to be a guinea pig, so to speak? Are you willing to go into other labs to really explore these dimensions with other scientists? Is this part of your aspiration?
Oh yeah, and I've had invitations to go to be under MRI and things like that while in jhana and while in nirodha samapatti and things like that. And these are all discussions that are happening. As to when and where that will happen, wonderful. We'll have to see. But I'm always open to it, and I say that with the understanding that there is a schedule now in terms of when I can and when I can't do these things, because there's retreats going on and I have my own self retreat and things like that. But I'm always open. I'm always open to Fantastic. Exploring this.
And so again, in a kind of devil's advocate's point of view, tremendous promise here, but peril. There's a little peril. There are shadow sides. Wherever you find light, you will find shadows. So any concerns about this sort of thing, the metrics, being like, now we have a measuring bar for science. So the near enemy of articulation is reification. You're articulating these incredibly refined, elegant states. Briefly go back to the jhanas. For many people go like, well, why should I be interested in this stuff? Because it helps you understand and articulate what is otherwise just a very fuzzy, woolly relationship to your own being. Now you have a very elegant map, extremely precise, articulate, that can describe the wonders of the mind. But again, the near enemy of that is in fact reification. That's a big problem. So talk to us a little bit about what some of the caveats, warning signs about capitulating to science, because are they in fact the arbiters of veracity and truth? how much do we take refuge in our first person experience and how much do we capitulate to what the scientists are telling us? Because I see some issues there.
Yeah. I mean, this is a discussion I had with Liam actually, some
Oh,
time
wonderful.
back, and with some other students, which is, I mean, there can come a point where science can sort of look at and map out each of these different wonderful states of mind, the jhanas and nirodha and so on and so forth. And it could be used in such a way that, okay, now we know exactly what brain states, what parts of the brain are active during these states. And now we can try to recapture that by certain kinds of machinery, or maybe a jhana pill. Somebody actually mentioned maybe we'll have a pill that you take and that activates certain parts of the brain and deactivate other parts of the brain, and regulate neurohormones and things like that and whatnot. But my response to that would be, okay, great. I mean, that might, let's say that is a possibility and that might happen and that people can actually access these states. But where is the wisdom behind it?
Yeah.
That's really the main thing here. I mean, even if you could, using these particular tools of science, capture and then be able to put the mind in these kinds of experiences, where is the wisdom of how that experience
Yeah.
arises? Where is the
Yeah.
wisdom of
Yeah.
how the mind takes this experience, and so on? So that's where we talk about samatha and vipassana, which is they have to be yoked together if you want full awakening. And so I think it can still be used as a tool, which is to say, and again, this is a discussion that Liam and I were having just for fun, is if science is able to recognize these different states and we're able to actually pull them apart, could we use neurofeedback as a way for people then to say, where am I in my experience? Sort of like a grading system of, well, you're getting here, but now you need to let go of this to
Yeah.
be able to do this.
Yeah.
So it's like a double-edged sword. You could do it in a way that helps people to be able to recognize where they are, or you can make it a drug and people just become addicted to it without any of the wisdom.
Absolutely. And again, I think one thing critically to maintain is that there's a difference between correlation and causation. Just because you're talking about neurophenomenology, right?
Yeah.
Basically, when we're working with neuroimaging and all the genius of what's happening in the science, it's very easy to conflate correlation with causation. And then when you do
Yeah.
that, you're capitulating what? To a materialistic point of view. And so this is where I get a little bit, my red warning flags go up, because, and again, love, big topic, maybe to unpack this at a future point, but the colossal difference between right view or wrong view. Wrong view is the degraded, physicalist, materialistic view. It's killing this planet. It's going to literally, you know where it's going to go, so to speak, versus right view, which in philosophical language is idealism. World is made of mind, heart, spirit. And so this is the danger that I see, Delson, is that I think the primacy, the reduction base is mind, heart, spirit. That's the reduction base, the ontological primitive. It's not this stuff. And so the risk I see is if we, so to speak, capitulate to the high priest of science and say, okay, now they have this, they've proven our thing. In a certain way, that lends credibility to the materialistic view, when in fact, what we want to do is create a revolution where, as some, in fact, the most sensitive physicists are saying, no, the world is not made of matter. The world is made of mind, mentation, mental processes. So to me, this is, I say this because you're nodding your head. I think it resonates with you.
Yeah.
This is right view. World is not made of matter. World is made of heart, mind, spirit. And so when we make this view to create these gentle bridges, that we can run into some problems if we're not really aware of that kind of thing. Don't you think?
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I completely resonate with it. Yes. Yes, I think right view, which is, as you rightly said, is that, it's not materialistic in nature. It is understanding that our world that we experience ultimately is made up of our experience of mind, of
Yeah.
mental processes. So perhaps what we can do is we can become like double agents. So I can become a guinea pig and then start to convert the scientists from materialists into,
Oh,
followers of right view.
that is brilliant. You can be a virus of wisdom that comes in and infects their operating system, right? That's fantastic. I love it. Stealth help. You're going to sneak them in there. You're going to give them data that they've never seen before, and they're going to go, hey, wait a second, what's going on here? And then they start. What that puts a crowbar into their worldview, right?
Yes.
Oh, I like it. Now I'm getting it. Now I'm getting it. So a couple of things as we start to close up, because really, again, Delson, I'm so respectful of your time. I could talk to you all day. We haven't even gotten to your book. There's so much more about Pratitya Samutpada that we could return to maybe at a future time. But one of the things I mentioned at the outset I want to return to now is I try to be as honest with myself about my blind spots, my biases, all the things that I don't see. It's like what Socrates once said so beautifully. The difference between you and me is I know that I don't know. And Bernstein talked about it, the myth of knowledge. What did he say beautifully? Well, paraphrasing the humorist Josh Billings, he said, it's not what you don't know that gets you in trouble. It's what you do know that just ain't so. And so from your perspective, and this is a little bit loaded question, but I think you get the generation where it's coming from. When you look at Tantra, Vajrayana practice and tradition, what do you see from your lens as potential blind spots? Like where can tantrikas be kidding themselves? What do you see as like, why are you not, I guess a point blank way to say it is, why are you not a tantrika versus a Theravadan? I mean, why do you align yourself more to the Theravadan versus the flavor of Vajrayana? What are the blind spots? What do you see as limitations? And I'm asking this very honestly, because blind spots by definition are insidious, intractable, and they can bury us. So what are some blind spots in the Tantric tradition that you see from your lens that can help be beneficial to Tantrikas?
Well, I will say it from the perspective of having experienced some of that, right? And being able to understand some of that. And so from my personal experience from it, and then coming to this particular tradition, I think it's probably also the reason the mind aligns to this tradition is just because of the predispositions, right? Just because of the fact that it's very systematic for me. Not to say that Tantra isn't. It definitely has its own different kinds of systems. But I think one of the key things to look for or to see or be aware of is this idea, and correct me if I'm wrong about my interpretation, this idea of how you can transform afflictive states or use afflictive states to get from a level of intensity to experience something that is beyond those afflictive states. For me, I don't know if that's necessarily always useful or practical. I can understand the theory behind it, and I can understand why that's happening. But I think practically, it might not always be as effective as just letting go and replacing them with non-afflictive states.
Yeah,
And that's a very small thing. I mean, that's just, yeah.
Let me say something about that, and then maybe if there's any other comments. This returns to the issue of upaya, skillful means, because this is my languaging. I write about it in my first book, what I call the 4 arts of transformation, where the arts are an acronym, somewhat related to the jhanas: abandon it, remedy it, transform it, self-liberate it. Hinayana, Mahayana, Vajrayana, Sahajayana. And so to me, Delson, and again, this is just my understanding, that depending on the head of steam, each one of these skillful means has its bandwidth of applicability depending on karmic predispositions of the practitioner, and also depending on the head of steam, again, the momentum, the karmic push that's there. So let's start at the very top. Sahajayana, the vehicle of self-liberation, Mahamudra Dzogchen. At this point, liberation there, my imaging is like snowflakes falling on the hot rock, or a campfire spark dissolving into the nighttime sky. The play is still there. The ornament, what previously was an adventitious defilement now becomes an ornament of the mind.
Mm.
And so the energy, it immediately arises. It's stillborn in both senses of that word. Stillborn, still keeps coming up, and stillborn in the sense of DOA, right? And therefore, that's a good bonfire. You've got enough heat, there's enough fire, it self-liberates like a bird flying in the sky, no karma. Okay, if you don't have that level of awareness, transformation, Tantra, Vajrayana. This is where the more alchemical tantric approaches of transforming energies like you're talking about come into play. And there's a whole battery of practices we could talk about. I'm sure you know some of these, the Yidam practices, the generation stage practices, meditations that take the electricity, the energetics of life, and allow you to transform lead into gold. Then, so I wouldn't say below that because that's pejorative, but subsuming that, then you have the remedial approach, the antitudinal approach of the Mahayana. And then you have the sometimes the abandonment, when it's just like Pema Chodron once said in relation to upheavals. She said at a certain point, just do something different, right? Just don't capitulate. Even if it means visualizing yourself as a log, don't capitulate to the energy. And so for me, Delson, this is why I like integral approaches. These 4 classic methods have applicabilities of bandwidth. And again, predispositions, like you say, makes a tremendous amount of sense to me. And so that's kind of the way I roll with that. But anything else when you look at Vajrayana, and you're not going to offend me, you're going to illuminate a lot of people when you say, well, I'm not so sure about that. That doesn't land with me. Yeah. What other things do you see in the Tantra tradition? Because as you know, in some classic texts, they look at Tantra as a bastardization of the Dharma. That it's like, oh, the Tantrikas just got lost in all this stuff. Yeah, so I'm curious if there's anything else that you see that we are not seeing as Tantrikas.
I mean, I would say that it's really just that main point that I brought up. I think, there's a lot of different things that we could talk about in terms of doctrinal differences. But I do agree with you that it is dependent upon, what people are inclined towards in terms of their karmic predispositions. So if it helps them to be able to realize the Dharma, if it helps them to understand it, then
beautiful,
by all means, But I think, we are definitely in agreement with that, which is we both subscribe, let's say, to the idea that you have to relax into things. You have to be able to, the abandonment that we talk about is really the relaxing of craving, the relaxing of contraction.
Opening the contraction. Yeah, terrific. One last thing, my friend. As you know, and again, I am tremendously appreciative. So you need to understand the context of the question I'm about to ask. I'm tremendously appreciative of your humility, your candor, your frankness. But as you know, you talk about stuff that people generally do not talk about. And there is this overt, covert kind of code of secrecy in the traditions. I mean, you know about this sort of stuff. The Taoist tradition says, he who knows does not speak, he who speaks does not know. Well, if that's true, we're both in really deep trouble, right? So on one level, like what did Rumi say? It's fantastic. This is great. Again, this is where we're going to end in a few minutes. Silence is the language of God. Everything else is poor translation. So we're poor translators. We're engaging in some dialogue because we live in a dualistic medium, in a world that uses dualistic language. And so we start where we are. And I think the key is, at least we're aware, hopefully, without kidding ourselves, of the limitations of what we're doing and what we're sharing. And so you speak, and again, I personally have to say, I personally am inspired by this. I'm not like, oh, geez, here's another one. No, it's like I listen to you, I see your presence, I see the way you manifest, I see what you do in the world. And it's like, well, real deal. But how do you work with that? Why are you so comfortable speaking about the relative cities, these powers, these miracles, these capacities? Talk to us a little bit again about that, which should not be talked about, right?
Yeah, I completely appreciate secrecy. Even when I was in the Kriya Yoga traditions, the idea was, you don't really talk about these things, because if you do, people might misunderstand, or they might even worse try to apply it for themselves and get into a lot of trouble. So I completely appreciate that fact. But the way I look at it now is, of course, there are certain things to be left for people to discover for themselves through the correct form of teaching and methodologies and everything else. But when I talk about these experiences, I just see them as you said, extraordinary. So,
Yeah.
you can take it for what it's worth, but to me, they're just no big deal,
Yeah.
right? I mean, talk about this all day long, and people, if it inspires them, wonderful. If it inspires them to do the practice, and if it inspires them to seek out the Dhamma, if it inspires them to you know make an end of suffering, because that's
Yeah.
ultimately what we're doing here. Is the Buddha says, I only teach two things:
Yeah.
suffering and the cessation of suffering.
That's it.
So if it inspires them in that way, then more power to it. But that's the only motivation of why I would talk about these things, is because two things: wisdom and compassion.
Beautiful.
That's really it.
Yeah, that's really fantastic. Anything else that I should have asked? Anything else that you want to share before we close up for today?
I'm really happy to have done this, and I hope we can do another one soon.
Yeah, really from my end, Delson, I've been working ever since I hung out with our mutual friend Liam back in December, and he was telling me more about you, and I'm going, gee, I need to check this guy out. You've really influenced me. You've touched me in a warm way, and your capacity as a practitioner, as an intellect scholar, it's a unique blend, and your ability to bring benefit into this world is no small thing. And so, yes, at a certain point, I mean, on one level, Pratitya Samutpada, one of my all-time favorite topics. And honestly, Delson, when I look at the tantric tradition, when I first discovered this, like 10 years into studying the tantric stuff, I said, why didn't I hear about this 10 years ago? To me, it was like, this stuff needs to be taught more. I found it to be among the most, if not the most, explanatory model of the generation of samsara and nirvana in verse, forward and reverse fashion that I've ever seen. Intellectual, I mean, arguably, right? The intellectual content of enlightenment. This is what the Buddha saw when he woke up, the ultimate lucidity. So if it works for you at some point, I'll stay in touch with Kun behind the scenes to really get into that now that people know a little bit more about you. Not that we skimmed, I don't think we skimmed today, but to take more of this granularity, this nuance, to understand how it is to return to the construction site, right? We are there, we can't blame, we are not victims of the world. We are the victims of the world that we co-create. If you want to blame someone for your suffering and your happiness, look in the mirror. And so by exploring this most fundamental archetype of the 12 links of dependent origination, with me perhaps bringing a little bit of the tantric interpretation. There are certain ways
Yes,
that the tantric people look at this, that maybe it would be of some benefit to others, because then if we see how we construct samsara, then we can better see how to deconstruct it. And therefore we're giving more doctrinal footing. And then in particular, then we can send people to the cushion. It's not just the map. Here's the territory. That's talking about suffering and the end of suffering. And so with your permission, maybe sometime when it works for you, let's get into the weeds a little bit more, talk about the 12 links in more depth, because they have massive application in the Bardo teachings. It's huge, as you know. I'm talking to the choir here, But until then, really, Delson, big bow of gratitude. I'm tremendously grateful for what you're doing. Thank you so much for taking time out of your life to chat with us. And I look forward to future encounters with you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Take care.